Silver at nearly $4,000 an ounce sounds insane the first time you hear it. I know, because that was my reaction too. When that number started circulating online this week, my first instinct wasn't excitement, it was skepticism. Numbers like that usually come from hype merchants, not serious analysis. But this one didn't come from a random influencer. It came from Tavi Costa, a professional macro analyst known for deep cycle work, not clickbait. And that's what made me stop scrolling and actually dig into the math. What I found surprised me. Not because I suddenly believe silver is guaranteed to hit that number, but because the math behind it isn't crazy at all. What's aggressive are the assumptions layered on top of that math. And that distinction matters, because when you separate the assumptions from the arithmetic, you're left with something most people aren't ready to confront. Even conservative scenarios imply silver prices that would completely change how this market is viewed. To understand where these numbers come from, you have to start with something almost nobody talks about anymore: the relationship between government debt and gold. During World War II, the United States ran massive deficits to fund the war effort. Debt exploded, but there was something fundamentally different about that period compared to today. Roughly half of all U.S. federal debt at the time was effectively backed by gold reserves. Not in theory, not symbolically, in real, measurable terms. About 51% of outstanding federal debt was covered by the value of gold held by the U.S. Treasury. That gold backing was the anchor. It's what gave the dollar credibility during the most expensive war in human history. People trusted U.S. debt because there was a tangible asset behind it. Fast forward to today, and the picture couldn't be more different. The United States still holds roughly 261 million ounces of gold. That hasn't changed much. What has changed is the scale of the debt surrounding it. Federal debt has ballooned so dramatically that gold now backs only about 3% of it. Same gold, vastly more debt. That shift alone tells you something important. Either debt eventually contracts or gold reprices higher to compensate. Historically, debt almost never gets meaningfully reduced through discipline. It gets resolved through inflation, default, or revaluation of real assets. And gold has always been the pressure valve. This is the foundation of the calculation that went viral. If you imagine a scenario where gold were revalued to back even a portion of current US debt the way it once did, the price required becomes staggering very quickly. To restore a World War II-style 51% backing ratio today, the value of US gold reserves would need to rise to roughly $20 trillion. Divide that by 261.5 million ounces, and you get a gold price in the neighborhood of $75,000 per ounce. That's not a prediction, it's arithmetic. Now, once you accept that number as a theoretical gold price under an extreme assumption, silver naturally enters the conversation. Because historically, silver doesn't move independently of gold. It moves in relation to it, and that relationship is measured by the gold to silver ratio. Take $75,000 gold and apply a ratio of 19 ounces of silver per ounce of gold, and you get silver at roughly $3,147 an ounce. That's the number that caused the internet to lose its mind. But here's where most people go wrong. They either accept that number as inevitable or dismiss it as impossible. Both reactions miss the point. The math is correct. I checked it multiple times. But the assumptions are extreme, and when you change those assumptions, the conclusions change too. Not to zero, not to something boring, to numbers that are still shocking, just less sensational. Let's start with the most aggressive assumption in the entire framework: that the US would ever return to a gold backing ratio anywhere near 51%. I don't believe that. No modern government is going back to a full gold standard. The global financial system runs on fiat currencies, central bank coordination, and confidence, not vault audits. But that doesn't make the exercise meaningless, because you don't need 51% backing to force a repricing. You don't even need half of that. In 1980, the last time gold completed a full debt-driven repricing cycle, gold backing relative to debt reached roughly 18%. Not because the US bought more gold, but because gold's price rose so dramatically that the value of existing reserves increased relative to debt. If you apply that same 18% benchmark to today's debt, gold doesn't need to be $75,000. It needs to be closer to $26,000. Cut the backing assumption even further, say 10%. Gold still needs to be around $15,000 an ounce. This is where the conversation gets uncomfortable, because even the boring scenarios imply gold prices several multiples higher than today. And that brings us to the second pillar of this framework, which I personally find even more compelling than the debt math: the Dow-to-gold ratio. This ratio compresses over a century of market psychology into a single line. It measures how expensive stocks are relative to gold. When the ratio is high, stocks are expensive and gold is cheap. When the ratio is low, gold is expensive relative to stocks. This ratio peaked in 1929, right before the Great Depression. It peaked again in the mid-1960s, then collapsed into 1980. It peaked again in 1999 at an all-time high near 45, marking the peak of the dot-com bubble. Since then, it's been trending lower. Right now, the Dow-to-gold ratio sits just under 10. That's not random. In 1973, just before gold began its most explosive move in modern history, the ratio was at almost the exact same level. From there, it fell to 1 by 1980. Stocks went sideways for a decade. Gold multiplied. This pattern has repeated 3 times in the last 100 years. Each time, it ended the same way. The analyst whose work sparked this discussion uses a target ratio of 2.5, not 1. That's important. It's not an extreme assumption. It's the middle of the historical move. If the Dow stayed roughly where it is today and the ratio fell to 2.5, gold would need to trade near $20,000 an ounce. If the ratio only fell to 5, gold would still be near $10,000. If it fell to 3.5, gold would be around $14,000. No version of this math leads to gold staying anywhere near current prices if the cycle completes. Now we bring silver back into the picture because this is where the volatility lives. Today, the gold to silver ratio is around 60. At the peak of panic in March 2020, it hit 125. At the peak of the last precious metals mania in 1980, it collapsed to 14. That 14 was extreme, distorted by the Hunt brothers' attempt to corner the silver market. It shouldn't be treated as a baseline, but neither should today's 60. In every precious metals bull market, the ratio compresses. The debate is how far. The aggressive framework uses 19. That's defensible historically, but rare. A more realistic range, based on multiple cycles, is somewhere between 30 and 40. Now watch what happens when you adjust just this one assumption. If gold reaches 20,000 and the ratio compresses to 35, silver trades around $570 an ounce. If the ratio compresses to 25, silver approaches $800. If gold only reaches 15,000 and the ratio stays at 35, silver still clears $400. This was the moment that changed how I looked at this entire debate. Even when I deliberately make every assumption conservative, boring, and cautious, silver still comes out several multiples higher than today's price. You don't need a perfect storm. You don't need central banks buying silver. You don't need a return to a gold standard. You just need history to rhyme. Of course, there are valid counterarguments, and they deserve to be addressed honestly. The most common one is supply. The idea that higher silver prices will incentivize more mining, which will cap prices. In theory, that makes sense. In reality, it has never stopped a debt-driven precious metals bull market. In the 1970s, gold rose 24 times. Silver rose 25 times. Mining output increased, but it didn't matter. Why? Because supply responses are slow. It takes years to permit, finance, and build new mines. Demand shocks happen faster than supply can react. We're seeing the same thing today. Silver has been in a structural supply deficit for years. Prices have risen, yet deficits persist. Above-ground inventories are being drawn down. Industrial demand continues to grow. The idea that supply will suddenly surge fast enough to neutralize a macro repricing ignores both history and reality. The second argument is that silver is no longer a monetary metal. Central banks don't hold it, they don't buy it. That's true, but it's also incomplete. Gold wasn't exactly embraced by central banks in the early 1970s either. It had just been demonetized. Governments were selling, not buying. And yet gold still became the asset of the decade. Silver today may not be monetary, but it is strategic. It's essential to energy infrastructure, electronics, defense systems, and medical technology. That industrial base creates a different kind of floor under demand. And here's the part most critics overlook. Central banks don't need to buy silver for the ratio to compress. Investment demand alone has done it repeatedly in the past. In fact, the fact that central banks aren't involved yet may be the most bullish aspect of all. It means the trade isn't crowded. Now let's talk risk, because no serious analysis is complete without it. The first risk is political discipline. If governments somehow manage to rein in deficits without inflation or crisis, the pressure on gold diminishes. History suggests this is unlikely, but it's not impossible. The second risk is a deflationary shock. In a severe liquidity crisis, everything sells off initially. Silver, being volatile, would likely drop hard before any long-term thesis plays out. The third risk is technological substitution. If silver were displaced in key industrial uses, demand would weaken. That's a longer-term risk, but it exists. With all that said, here's my honest conclusion. The extreme $3,147 silver number is not a forecast. It's a theoretical ceiling built on the most aggressive assumptions. I wouldn't anchor to it. But dismissing the entire thesis because that number sounds outrageous is a mistake. When you strip the analysis down to its conservative core, silver still looks profoundly undervalued relative to debt, history, and its relationship to gold. We are not at the start of a new cycle. We are deep into one that began in the late 1990s and has not yet completed its mean reversion. People who bought gold in the early 1970s were mocked. People who held silver through years of stagnation were called fools. History did not remember those opinions kindly. Markets don't move when narratives feel comfortable. They move when reality forces repricing. And whether silver goes to 400, 600, or something higher over the next decade, one thing is already clear. The math is no longer on the side of complacency.